Hi, we move into Luke 23 today as the Sanhedrin rises as a body and brings Jesus before Pilate. So as we do, you can see on the right side of the screen where we're proceeding through Luke's story of the passion and death of Jesus. We're in this section here, 23, 1 to 6, which is part of this larger chiasm, 23, 1 to 12, that we'll look at in just a minute. And what we're going to also see is how, as we looked at in chapter 22, Luke is reshaping the tradition that he received from Mark in his own ways. And so just taking a quick glimpse at this page here that compares all four, you can see the parts in bold are the parts that are unique to each of the authors. So you can see Luke's is almost unique, entirely unique to him. And curiously, the parts in purple are the parts he has in common with John, which are a few. And also just a note here, we see Mark's is just 15 verses. Matthew's is 26 verses, but we see in between here, verses 3 to 10, are the story of Judas seeking to repent for having taken the money and going out and hanging himself. So that's the part I've left off here. But even without that part, Matthew's goes this much farther than Mark's, and Luke's goes this much farther, and John's goes that much farther, and I've even put John's in smaller print to fit it on 2 pages here. This is all kind of small print, but thanks to monitors, you can zoom in on and zoom out if you're looking at it at home on a small screen. So we're really going to see how Luke has shaped this to make his own purposes as we've been seeing throughout. And one of those purposes we'll see here involves requiring us to know what his audience would have known, or would they, who Pontius Pilate was. And I say, why would they? Because as far as we know, Pilate ruled as procurator or governor of the Roman province of Judea from 26 to 36 or 37 of the Common Era. But if Luke was writing some 50 years later, he would certainly just be a distant memory. And why would Romans throughout the Roman Empire know anything about an obscure governor named Pilate, for whom there's very little actual physical evidence? If you look online, you can see a number of pictures that purport to be Pilate from sculpture and otherwise, but really we have no idea whatsoever. It's only this 1961 stone, or the stone found in 1961, it's not from 1961, that gives any physical proof that Pilate was a real person. And so there's really no question about that. Josephus refers to him as the governor at the time, and so does Philo. In fact, as I write in my book Empire Baptized, one of Philo's nephews eventually became Pilate's replacement. The idea of a Hellenistic Jew taking the position that was empowered to crucify a Jew like Jesus is just shocking, but that shows how far Philo was from the way of Jesus in understanding his relationship with Rome. But we don't need to go off on Philo here. But we do need to understand something about Pilate. And no one has done more to try to create a picture of Pontius Pilate than Warren Carter, whose books on various Gospels and Empire have been very helpful to me, and he's a wonderful scholar. He wrote an entire book, and he summarized some of the points under the rubric of Bible Odyssey, which is a function of the Society of Biblical Literature, trying to provide background to the Bible for ordinary people. Anything you can find at Bible Odyssey is probably pretty reliable, based on solid scholarship. And he notes a couple of things that I want to put up in these just brief quotes from his piece. One of the problems in trying to understand Pilate in this scene was that from the earliest times, Christianity was founded to be anti-Jewish. And that's not a prejudicial statement on my part, it's just a fact. And if you want to know the facts about it, you could read more in my book Empire Baptized. I won't go through all the details here. But the long and short of it is, the Christian philosopher, or I should say the Stoic and Platonic philosophers who wanted to invent something called Christianity, realized that they had to suggest it was old, and so they had to claim that they were the inheritors of the biblical tradition and that the Jews were wrong and misguided and hard-headed and all those openly anti-Semitic things. Otherwise, the Romans would have looked upon their idea of a new religion as novel and questionable, given the conservatism of the Roman government. So there's no question that the early Christian writers were blatantly anti-Jewish in the most gross sort of ways, sadly, the kinds of things we can see today. The other error they made was in seeking to separate out religion from politics, and no modern scholar would do that in the ancient world. There's really no separate category called religion at all in the ancient world, because it's the power of various divinities that purport to justify and empower nations. And certainly the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods, was understood as the basis for the Pax Romana, and our story is challenging that absolutely. So modern scholarship has gotten past, at least at some level, the blatant anti-Judaism that sees Rome as just innocent bystanders, and it's the vicious, terrible Jews who wanted to kill Jesus, the Christian Messiah. And also also the incorrect understanding that religion and politics are separate. So when we get rid of those bad presuppositions, we can see Pilate for who he is. And as Carter notes, as many other scholars have noted, he was what he had to be, a bloodthirsty, ruthless upholder of the Roman order. And that's not making a personal statement about Pilate. We know almost nothing about him personally. But the office required him to maintain peace in Jerusalem. His normal place to be was in Caesarea, the wonderful seaside resort town north of Jerusalem. And here's a picture of the remains of his beachside Mediterranean palace that I got to see about a decade ago. And why wouldn't he rather be there with the hippodrome and international visitors and all kinds of intellectual stimulation rather than the perceived backwater of Jerusalem, where these local rebellious people are always stirring up trouble, and especially at Passover, when the memory of their freedom, at least the narrative of their freedom and being liberated from the Egyptians, is what's being celebrated. So Pilate's in Jerusalem reluctantly and with the single mission of keeping the peace during the Passover and hopefully for his own sake getting back to Caesarea and sitting by the Mediterranean breeze. But of course that's not exactly how it unfolds here. And so we're going to have to look at Pilate as portrait here in Luke as a function of Luke's perspective rather than historical account of who Pontius Pilate really was. The other thing to note is Luke has a particular struggle here. Luke doesn't have a struggle. We have a struggle in pinning down where exactly this is happening. So we see in verse 1, the assembly rose as a body and brought Jesus before Pilate. The last thing we heard was that they were the chief priest's house. And so where is this? We can look at two different maps to try to get an idea, but the reality is archaeologically we simply don't know. So I've shown this map before, and Gethsemane is outside the city right here, and they had to bring Jesus in the gate to bring him to the high priest's house, which on this map is shown here. But where's the praetorium? So on this more modern map, one of the notions is that since Pilate wasn't a regular resident in Jerusalem, he wouldn't have his own praetorium, and that he'd use the house of the high priest Caiaphas as his house. Caiaphas is not mentioned at all in Luke. He's mentioned in John. So we just don't have any basis for that. And the reality is that's as far as we can get. We just really can't say. So with that in mind, let's look at how Luke has shaped this particular section here. We're going to look at 1 to 6, which is just really up to here. And we see the chiastic unit here that I was mentioning from verses 1 to 12, framed around they began to accuse him, and then continuing again with they vehemently accused him. And then in the B parts, Pilate said, "Are you king of the Judeans?" And Jesus answers, "You say so." And then when Herod questions him, and Jesus gives no answer. And in the middle is the transition from Pilate to Herod. And we'll see at the end of the chiasm here, the counterfactual political non-reality that Luke portrays here is on that day Herod and Pilate became friends. Before that they'd been enemies. And of course we'll look more at that next video when we get there. So this is the way he's shaping it, and then we'll see that there are more chiastic shapes as we go throughout the chapter, including the entire crucifixion story there. So I'll leave this up a little bit here, and we'll begin to enter into our story, realizing we don't know exactly where it's taking place, and that's perhaps part of what Luke's point is. It's taking place in this sort of ethereal place between Jesus and Pilate, regardless of where it physically might be. We see the assembly here, to plethos here, not presbyterion, as we saw earlier, for the assembly of the elders, or the Sanhedrion for the assembly of the council, but here's literally the fullness, highlighting their unity in opposing Jesus. And of course that will also be parallel to the unity of Herod and Pilate on the other side of the chiasm. So it says they rose as a body, and as green note, as I was suggesting, signifies the solidarity with which the assembly of elders acts. And they brought Jesus before Pilate. And notice he's not named Pontius Pilate. He's only been named twice before, as you can see in my note below. Back there in chapter 3, when Luke set the political terms for John the Baptist's appearance. And there he's called Pontius Pilate and referred to as governor. He's mentioned in 13:1 as simply the example that Jesus gives of those who fell in the tower and those whose blood Pilate mingled with the sacrifices as examples of repentance. And so he wasn't really the focus there. But here he's referred to like we all know who he is. His name Pontius isn't given, and he's not given the title governor much. And we note in Matthew, he's repeatedly referred to as the governor. We see Pilate the governor, but the governor, the governor, the governor throughout. So for Matthew, the key issue is his title, and yet for Luke, it's just Pilate. And one could ask why that is. It's hard to argue from silence. But perhaps the issue is that he's not really honoring, Luke that is, not really honoring the Roman holding of office and just putting Pilate up there as a human being faced with the decision of Jesus, just like his audience is. But again, it's hard to argue from silence. So once they appear here, and we know nothing about whether Pilate knows about this or not, we saw the arresting party seem to be the soldiers and the chief priests. In contrast to what we see, for example, in John's Gospel, where the arrest clearly includes Roman soldiers, and by the time they get Jesus to Pilate, we can assume that Pilate, playing naive like he doesn't know what's happening, is a sham. It's a performance to bring in the Judeans. And in my John's Gospel series that I haven't started yet here on Radical Bible, but in the books I've written on John's Gospel, I show that in detail. But we don't know that here. We don't know whether Pilate is in on this or knows anything about it. Just as a matter of political everyday life, there's no reason to think he would know about it. As I noted, he would be in Caesarea, and Jesus going around Galilee and perhaps around Samaria and all the places he went on the journey to Jerusalem for the 11 chapters from Luke 9 to 19 would not bring anything to Pilate's attention. Perhaps John the Baptist and the people from Jerusalem coming out to Galilee in the beginning would, but it was only a momentary thing. So it's perfectly realistic that Pilate showing up for Passover really knows nothing about this obscure character who, after all, is not on the internet and not on the cover of the Jerusalem Times. But we don't know whether this is Pilate performing or Pilate genuinely naive. And yet this is early in the morning, right after the cock has crowed, and so it is certainly an unusual time for them to be appearing there, and had to be some preparation for Pilate to be ready to receive them, but we don't know what it is. So this is all we know, and we'll have to just continue from that. They began to accuse him, and as I was noting in the last video with the sequence of Peter's denial and the question of Pilate, in Mark and Matthew, the accusations came before the denial of Peter in the first scene. So in our scenes here, we don't see any specific accusations. We just hear the general statement. He was accused by the chief priest, and the chief priest accused him of many things. But here in Luke, we hear specific accusations, and none of them make any sense at all. But it's good to clarify them to at least see what's on the mind of both Luke and Jesus' opponents here. So saying, we found this man perverting our nation. Diastrepho here, meaning to twist or pervert, but in the political sense. It's used almost exclusively, like in Deuteronomy, leading people away from God, and that's the way it's used in other places. And Jesus uses it, as Paul does in Philippians, to refer in a generic way to this perverse and twisted generation. So it refers to people who are leading people away. In the later Christian sense, perhaps like heresy. People are leading people away from what, quote, we know to be the truth. But it's as a nation that's the issue. It's not about individuals. It's an ethnos here. And that's also what's connected with the taxes issue, which is not taxes at all, but tribute. And this is one of the great mistakes made, and I noted it when we looked at the story in chapter 20 about whether it's lawful to give money to Caesar or not, that this is not about the ordinary tax collector. It has nothing whatsoever to do with the question of whether people in a Western democracy should pay a portion of their income to the government to provide for goods and services. This has to do with tribute. And that's the word here for us, tribute. As the Low-Nita lexicon notes, which has no political horse in the game here, in the race, so to speak, a payment made by the people of one nation to another, with the implication that this is a symbol of submission and dependence. And that's what the important thing is, and that's exactly what would be at issue. Would the Judean people here, the nation of Judea in this sense, not the Jewish people in the broader sense of people who are covenanted to Yahweh, but the people in the province of Judea under Roman supervision, are they going to acknowledge that the Roman emperor is actually in charge of them by offering to pay that? And in fact, they were exempted from that, from offering tribute. Instead, there was just a small tax, the fiscus judaicus, that was given as an exception, so that they wouldn't have to destroy the nation altogether, which is, of course, what ends up happening in Jerusalem and Judea anyway. But this is not about paying personal income taxes. This is the question of, would they make the symbolic public act of submitting as a nation to the emperor? And that question didn't come up at all. And of course, we know from the earlier story, he said, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's. So as we saw in the previous scene, the issue of them trying to find accusations or the words that came from his mouth when he didn't say he was the Messiah or the Son of God has little to do with this. They're willing to make it up as they go along, as is so often the case. and saying that he himself is the Messiah king, which he explicitly didn't say. They accused him of that, and he says, you're the one who says so. So none of these charges are true. Neither of these charges are true if we assume that perverting a nation is illustrated by the supposed forbidding to pay tribute and claiming himself to be the Messiah, an alternative king. Presumably, he says the Messiah king for Pilate's sake, since Pilate would have no idea what a Messiah was. Why would he? Unless he'd been trained in the local culture for the sake of being able to understand it enough to keep order. But as we so often know in colonial situations, it's misunderstanding of the local culture that leads to trouble, not the attempt of the outsiders to bother to learn how the people they've colonized really see things. So that's what's brought before them, and Pilate does not respond to them at all. Notice he doesn't respond to any of the other charges, not about taxes and not about perverting the nation at all. He just goes on his own agenda. Following Mark, as you can see on the right side of the screen, asks, are you the king of the Judeans? And although this New Revised Standard almost all have Jews there for Judean, I would argue at length, and have argued at length, but I won't now, that the proper term is Judeans. And if you want to know more about that, you can see it from this book, where I have a short essay on it in John's Gospel. But the reason I want to say that more broadly is that Jews do not have a king. The word king is a political title for the leader of a region of people within a geographic place, especially in the Roman world, where the Roman emperor was obviously king of the entire Roman Empire. And so to be a king of the Judeans is to suggest someone who would be a threat to Rome's hegemony, in particular to Herod's, although not the Herod we'll see, who's the Herod from Galilee, we'll see in the next video. But there are more than one Herod. And so king of the Jews just makes no sense. It would be like saying king of the Muslims. Well, where? There are Muslims in Indonesia and all over the Arab world and all over the United States. So what would king of the Muslims be? But if you could say king of a particular nation where Muslims live, that could make some sense. And so that's what's at issue here. Are you king of the Judeans? And as he answered earlier, you're the one who says so. So he doesn't say yes and he doesn't say no. But we've already seen that's not the title he claims. The title he claims is the human one from Daniel 7, which is certainly a royal title, but not one that Pilate would understand. So having gotten the short answer, you say so, Pilate turns back to them. As Green notes below, not because Jesus and his message constitute no threat to Rome. Rather, Pilate has thus far been unable to discern any such threat. This can only be regarded as a manifestation of Roman arrogance. So that's Green's take on Pilate's character here. So Pilate says to the chief priests and the crowds, and suddenly there are crowds. Where did they come from? And that's one of the complexities of the narrative here that leads us to wonder where this is taking place. If we presume that it was inside in the Praetorium, which is just the Latin for the Roman governor's palace, then there certainly wouldn't be crowds on the inside. And yet it's not on the stone pavement, which is the second place where Pilate takes Jesus in John's Gospel, because in John's Gospel the issue is that the Judeans don't want to defile themselves for the Passover and go inside. So John's Gospel has a wonderful chiastic dance of Jesus and Pilate on the inside and Pilate and the Judeans on the outside. But we don't see any inside and outside thing here, so this must be outside. But we'll note each time we see Pilate, in terms of this chapter, it's going to be with other opponents. So here is the assembly as a body, here it's the crowds, and later on we'll see other variations. The crowds are not otherwise named here, and the last time we saw crowds was on the journey to Jerusalem. We've seen an individual crowd, but the sense of crowds as a plural is certainly suggesting there's a large group. And at Passover, the Jerusalem temple area and the entire city would be filled, but they wouldn't necessarily all be focused on this event. So he says immediately, I find no basis for an accusation against this man. Literally, as you can see below from the Greek, I find no reason in this person. There's an implicit seeking but not finding, and we've seen several of those from Jesus' opponents. We saw the chief priests were seeking a way to turn him over, but couldn't do it for the sake of the crowd that they were afraid of. Of course, they had Judas finally to help them with that. So Pilate is seeking a basis for an accusation, but can't find one, which is suggesting he'd like to collaborate with the Sanhedrin here, but he's not able to find one under Roman law. And this goes to the Carter point that I was making earlier. Is Pilate just simply a wimp here? Is he just a purely legal jurist and he's not going to engage in a kangaroo court and a political activity here to put this man in prison or to have him killed if he doesn't find a legal basis for it? Or is this just playing around with the Sanhedrin for his own purposes? At the moment, we can't decide, so we're going to have to continue continue the story to see if we can infer something about the character and motivations going on here. But their response is to insist. And unlike in John's Gospel, where they play the Caesar card against Pilate and say, if you release this man, you're no friend of Caesar, this is how they respond here. The word for insisting here, episkuo, here is only here in the New Testament, and the places in the Septuagint it's used are not related. But it's a strong word there. And it should suggest the ongoing insisting. He stirs up the people. Anasei, only other use in the New Testament is in Mark 15, where the chief priest stirred up the crowd. And this is certainly the image of stirring up, even though that's a metaphor. Obviously, there's no bowl and there's no spoon here, but it's certainly the sense of agitating people, disturbing the peace, as we might say. And the so-called crime of disturbing the peace in the United States, not that far from this, didn't originally involve just drunks on the street corner or people making loud noises with stereos in their car, but it meant protesters disturbing the peace of the capitalist status quo at the time of labor resistance and labor organizing. So disturbing the peace was not just somebody who's making a lot of noise in the American context, but always, like it is here, had a political component, that the status quo was understood as peace, and if you want to change it, you're disturbing that. And so that's what's at issue here. But it's expressed in terms of teaching throughout all of Judea, from Galilee, where he began, even to this place, or literally even until here. Pilate probably wouldn't care that much about Galilee. It's far away. His concern is Judea, and yet it's suggesting there's a movement taking place. The curious reality that Luke's audience knows about is when the Romans come to recapture Jerusalem in the war, they will come from Galilee through Judea even to this place, as we heard symbolically expressed in chapter 21 of the Apocalyptic Discourse earlier. So, when Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And is he hearing that by accent, or is it just because of this? We saw that Peter seemed to be recognized as a Galilean out in the courtyard, but we don't know here. Is it just because they said he started in Galilee? But that's where he asked whether he's a Galilean. Notice that Galileos here is parallel to Judean here. It's not suggesting any kind of religion. It's suggesting a place you're from. So similarly as the question of Jesus being a king of the Judeans, here he would be a Galilean. And of course it would make sense to claim to be a king of the Judeans if you were in Galilee. So that may be the question that Pilate thinks, I can shuck this off on Herod for a while. And when he learned that he was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him off to Herod. And we'll have to investigate next time the character of Herod, who only in Luke's Gospel makes an appearance in the Passion story, and which Herod it is he's talking about. And we'll get back to that next time. See you then. Bye-bye.